Happy Halloween, everybody. This is Kyle Snyder once again, aka Clipton, and this time I am doing a top 12 list of all the Star Trek movies of all time. As you can see, I'm dressed up as a Starfleet officer this year for Halloween, so I figured this time, this is the perfect time for me to do my thoughts on what are the worst and what are the best Star Trek movies of all time. That being said, here we go. Number 12, Nemesis. I felt that this was the worst Star Trek movie of all time. It was definitely the worst next generation film of all time. The last one, it had a good villain and it had a good final space battle and all, but in my opinion, it didn't feel too much like Star Trek. It would have been better if it were directed by Jonathan Frakes, who directed the previous two Star Trek films, Insurgency and First Contact, but, obviously this was the worst way to give the Next Generation crew a send-off. They deserved a lot better than this. Number 11, Insurgency. This felt like a 2 or 3-parter episode on TV rather than a movie, in my opinion. It did have some good moments, like the Riker maneuver and Captain Picard outwitting the main villain at the end, but it really felt like something that needed to be seen on TV rather than on the big screen, in my opinion. So, and I know it's strange that I'm putting Insurgency ahead of Nemesis, but, every Trekkie has their own opinions on best and worst Star Trek films of all time. In my opinion, Insurgency wasn't the worst. Number 10, The Final Frontier. This was definitely the worst film of the original 6 Star Trek movies. It was directed by William Shatner. He tried to use some funny moments. There were some that were funny, but others not so much. The main point of Final Frontier was them exploring the center of the galaxy, seeing this god entity, and of course Captain Kirk realized that it wasn't really God because, the entity said, "This ship, the Enterprise, it will carry my presence throughout the cosmos." And of course Kirk pointed out, what does God need with a starship? And, and he was dead on with that because, really, God doesn't need a starship to explore the galaxy or the universe. If he wants to go anywhere in the universe, he can. No starship required. Anyways, next up, number 9, the motion picture. This was the very first Star Trek movie ever put out. It was put out in 1979, and of course it was 10 years since America, as well as the entire world, had seen Star Trek. So obviously it had humble beginnings. The main premise was the crew gets back together and they have to, figure out what exactly Voyager is, and to solve its puzzle. And it had some philosophical questions throughout the movie as well. Like, why was I born? What is my purpose in life? Is this all that I am? Nothing more? It had some thought provocations in it. And plus, interesting enough, this was the only Star Trek movie that was rated G. The rest were either PG or PG-13. Anyways, number 8, Generations. This was the very first Next Generation Star Trek film. It featured Captain Picard and Captain Kirk teaming up for the first and only time against Sauron, who sought to create some kind of energy wave paradox type of thing that allowed him immortality. And it's kind of hard to explain. You have to see it to understand what exactly he was doing. But other notes about this film, it was also the last film that we ever saw the Enterprise D. It got taken out by, Klingon sisters, the bird of prey ended up getting destroyed, but not before it managed to cause a warp core breach in the Enterprise D, in which the Enterprise had to separate the saucer part from the engine part. The engine part blew up and the saucer part crash landed. Of course, very few died on the Enterprise, but of course, the Enterprise D was so damaged it couldn't be salvaged. Why we got the Enterprise E in the next three next generation films. Let's see, number 7, Search for Spock. And this film was about average as far as the original 6 movies go. I mean, it carried on from Wrath of Khan. The premise of the plot was they realized that Spock may not be permanently lost, that Spock transferred his soul over to Bones before he died in Wrath of Khan, and they have to go back to Genesis and retrieve the body, but of course there are Klingons there, and they realize that they have to set the Enterprise to self-destruct, to sacrifice the original Enterprise, to destroy half of the Klingon fleet or the Klingon crew. It had a good battle between Kirk and Commander Krug. And, yeah, it was a pretty good movie. It's like, not the best, but not the worst. I mean, it's definitely worth seeing. It was good, in my opinion. Number 6, First Contact. Definitely the best Next Generation film of all time. I mean, it featured the most intimidating enemy in Star Trek history, the Borg. And the Borg find a way to go back in time, and obviously the crew of the Enterprise has to go through, along with the Borg back to April 2063, to prevent the Borg from preventing First Contact from happening, because if First Contact doesn't happen, then there's really no motivation for humanity to build starships and to explore the galaxy, because First Contact was all about finding out that we are not alone in the universe. And that's true in reality. We're not alone in the universe, and I'll explore that more in a later video, because, I personally believe we're not alone in the universe. But, yeah, I'll go into that later. Anyways, moving on. Number 5, Star Trek, the 2009 Star Trek, that is. I mean, and a lot of people are calling it a reboot. I call it a sequel because, obviously, it continues on with Star Trek, except, a group of Romulans going back in time and altering parts of history, and it really explores what Star Trek would have been if certain events had played out differently. If if an enemy group had actually succeeded in altering certain events of time, and it had good action, it had good humor in it, it had good. It had an exciting battle at the very beginning of the film. The first 10 minutes definitely catch your attention. It's definitely worth seeing. Let's see, number 4, The Voyage Home. Many people consider this the absolute best Star Trek film of all time. I mean, in my opinion, it is one of the best, maybe not the absolute best, but, it was different in a good way because, it didn't really involve any space battles or hand-to-hand combat of that type, but it did involve the crew of the former Enterprise, to go back in time to 1986 San Francisco, trying to interact with the people from 3 centuries ago, and yeah, it had great humor in it. It had, it had an exciting story where they had to get 2 humpback whales and transport them to the future so that they can communicate with a probe in order to save Earth. Yeah, if you haven't seen The Voyage Home, you have to see it. It's a great movie. Let's see, number 3, Into Darkness. The latest Star Trek movie that has come out. In my opinion, it's the 3rd best of all time. It had great action in it. It had great story. It follows up with what would have happened if certain events in Star Trek lore had played out differently. We get to see, we get to explore more about Admiral Marcus as to why he wanted a Klingon war. We get to explore more about, what Khan would have been like or what he would have done had he been awoken earlier. That type of stuff. It's an exciting Star Trek film. Definitely one to see. It is out on DVD now. If you haven't seen it, go ahead, see it. Great movie. Number 2, The Undiscovered Country. One of my favorite Star Trek movies of all time. You know, this was the very last movie of the original 6. You know, it had it all. It had a great conspiracy plot. It had a great, you know, it had a great plot of Kirk escaping from a prison planet. You know, it had an interesting space battle between a cloaked bird of prey that's able to fire, you know, against the Enterprise A and the Excelsior. It had a great conspiracy plot to it, and it had a very emotional send-off from the original cast of Star Trek. It's definitely one that you have to see. And finally, the number 1 greatest Star Trek movie of all time, you guessed it, Wrath of Khan. I mean, it had it all. It had one of the best space battles in all of Star Trek. You know, it had one of the most heroic sacrifices in all of movie history. With Spock being exposed to radiation in order to repair the core so that they can get out of harm's way before the Genesis device set off. You know, and of course it had that moment where Kirk yelled out, "Khan!" You know, that it's something that cannot be intimidated by anyone else. I mean, only William Shatner could pull off the Khan yell so well. I mean, here's my attempt of it. Khan! Alright, maybe that's not as good as William Shatner, but yeah. But anyways, that's my top 12 list of Star Trek films of all time. Can't wait for Star Trek 13 to come out in 2 to 3 years. So thank you very much for watching. And as the Vulcans would say, live long and prosper.